Hello and a very warm welcome this Sunday evening to a special 2-hour broadcast of India Today. We'll try and address all the questions that are swirling in your mind on the vaccines that got approval this morning from the Union government. How safe are these vaccines? Should you be queuing up to get a vaccine if you're eligible at this moment? By when will these vaccines be available? Privately, has the data been adequately peer reviewed? What are the potential side effects? All these and a lot more. And I'll be joined by some key scientists, decision makers, chief executives who are all involved in the vaccine rollout process. I want to introduce just at the start of this broadcast my first guest, Dr. Adrian Hill. He is the director of the Jenner Institute at Oxford University, one of the key brain think tanks involved in the production of the Oxford University vaccine, which got approval this morning. We'll also be joined by the Chief Executive of Serum Institute, Adar Poonawalla. We'll be speaking to the Director General of the Indian Council of Medical Research. We'll be speaking to the government's principal scientific advisor and to the man heading the government's COVID task force. So we have a power-packed broadcast lined up. But what I want to do right at the top is to show you this very brief briefing by the Drug Controller of India, where no questions were taken, but essentially it was announced officially, what's been known for a couple of days now, that two vaccine candidates, one of Bharat Biotech and the other of the Serum Institute in Pune, have now been given emergency use approval. And over the next 7 to 14 days, the vaccine rollout process in this country will start officially and people will be injected with the first dose of what could be a life-saving vaccine. Here is our lead story tonight.
The magic bullet is finally here. India finally gets its vaccines for coronavirus. In a major breakthrough against COVID-19, the Drugs Controller General of India approved two vaccines for emergency use. On Sunday, the DCGI gave its nod to Serum Institute of India Covishield and Bharat Biotech's Covaxin vaccines. The developers, however, will continue with their clinical trials.
Phase 2 clinical trials were conducted in approximately 800 subjects, and results have demonstrated that the vaccine is safe and provides a robust immune response. The subject expert committee has reviewed the data on safety and immunogenicity of the vaccine and recommended for grant of permission for restricted use in emergency situation.
But Covishield and Covaxin, which is India's first indigenous vaccine, will be administered in 2 doses each. While Covaxin showed 60% efficacy, Serum Institute's Covishield showed 70% efficacy.
In the beginning, it will be basically Serum Institute of India, the AstraZeneca vaccine which will be given. They already have 50 million doses available, and they will be able to give that to the initial phase where we will vaccinate around 3 crore people.
Clearing the air on massive rollout of the vaccine, Serum Institute of India CEO Adar Poonawalla told India Today that the vaccine could be made available in markets as early as next month.
We were thinking probably March or April, but if we can satisfy all the requirements of the government and give it to the needy and the most vulnerable, as I mentioned before that, and the government eases their restrictions, then, that date could be as soon as February in the private market.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Modi welcomed the DCGI's decision and said that approval of two vaccines is a decisive turning point to strengthen a spirited fight.
The next mammoth task for the government would be the procurement as well as the distribution of the vaccines that have received emergency use authorization. Serum Institute's Covishield as well as Covaxin of Bharat Biotech will now be produced at breakneck speed and distributed across various states so that India can begin the vaccination drive. Milan Sharma for India Today.
Joining me live and exclusive on the Newstrack is one of the world's leading vaccinologists, director of the Jenner Institute at the Oxford University, where this AstraZeneca vaccine has been developed, Professor Adrian Hill. He's the Lakshmi Mittal and Family Professorship of Vaccinology, director of the Jenner Institute, co-director of the Oxford Martin Program for Vaccines, has worked before this on the Ebola vaccine, the malaria vaccine, is an expert on immunology, vaccinology of infectious diseases, and he's just the guy we need to speak to when the Indian government has granted approvals to these two vaccines for an independent perspective, outside of what we're hearing from companies in India, outside of what we're hearing from the government in India, for an independent global perspective on the vaccine rollout. Professor Hill, welcome to India Today.
Thank you.
Congratulations. This is a big day for you and your team at the Jenner Institute, and for India, the first approvals coming through formally. How confident are you that the vaccine that you and your team have developed so painstakingly is the solution that the world has been waiting for?
Well, we have a lot of advantages with this vaccine. There's going to be a lot of it available. Tens of millions of doses already today, manufactured, ready to go, and much of that in India. We're also very confident that this will be distributed at low cost. This is a non-profit vaccine, so the price of it will probably be lower than most, if not all, other vaccines. And it's pretty simple to deliver. You can store it in a refrigerator. You don't need a freezer or deep freeze as with some other vaccines. And all of those advantages should play into what's most important now, which is really rapid deployment.
How does your vaccine, Professor Hill, compare with Moderna and Pfizer? I ask this because the Indian government says that the Oxford University vaccine has an efficacy of 70%. Moderna and Pfizer are claiming 90 and 94.5. To a layman, that would suggest that the Oxford vaccine isn't quite as efficacious as the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. Is that a fair reading of the data?
I think that's over-reading rather limited data that are not directly comparable. So let me explain. There are three things that you would like a vaccine to do against COVID. Most importantly, most people think, is to prevent severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And the very good news is that all of the vaccines you've been mentioning, including the AstraZeneca vaccine, are very close to 100% in terms of their efficacy against severe disease and death. And that's, I would argue, the most important feature of the vaccine. It's not the easiest to measure. It's easier to measure clinical cases, most of which are fairly mild. And that's the number that you have been quoting for Moderna, which is of the order of 90 to 95%. For the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, the efficacy against mild COVID depends on how you use the vaccine. In other words, do you give a single dose where the efficacy is 73%, or do you give two doses at a long interval, maybe 3 months between the first and the second, which we're now seeing is giving higher efficacy? And that makes sense to us because the immune response is stronger if you have a 3-month interval between the first and second dose. So many regulators are taking the view that that might be advantageous. It's easier to deploy in an emergency setting if you don't have to give the first and second dose within a few weeks. And finally, the third thing you like a vaccine to do is to prevent transmission. That's much harder to measure. Can you measure whether the vaccine is stopping people who are vaccinated giving the virus to other people? And we have preliminary data on that, which suggests that that is possible. as well. So I'm afraid it's a complicated picture in terms of exactly how these vaccines compare. The trials have been done somewhat differently, but the really good news is that all of them are very highly effective against severe COVID and death.
You just mentioned that the AstraZeneca Oxford University Serum Institute vaccine has higher efficacy when the gap between the first dose and the second dose is 3 months. How does it then compare? If the gap, when it's 28 days, the efficacy is 70.2%, when the gap is 3 months, in the trials that you've been conducting, what is the efficacy that you're picking up, and when will these trials be made public and peer reviewed?
So one of those, well, we have many groups in the trial that we have undertaken in the UK, in Brazil, and in South Africa. Some of those groups, as we have reported, you can see efficacy as high as 90%. With other regimens, it may be more like 80% with the 3-month interval. And as you say, these data are still being acquired because the more groups you have in a trial, the smaller the numbers you have per group have to be. But, you know, we're not particularly concerned about whether it's 80% or 90% or 95%. What we're primarily trying to do here is to end the pandemic, stop people dying, and those are endpoints for which the vaccine does look very effective, particularly against severe disease. And of course, there was an attempt some months ago by WHO and others to have head-to-head comparisons of these vaccines. That proved to be very difficult. It has not happened yet. So I think we have to accept that these vaccines are all pretty highly efficacious and very useful to deploy, and that to compare them head-to-head now would be very difficult because we're deploying the vaccines and that's the top priority.
So let's take an efficacy of 80%. Explain to common viewers what that means. Does that mean that 80% of those who administered the vaccine will then not have to worry about COVID? They won't get COVID for how long? And what does it mean for the other 20% who are not part of the 80% that get covered? Does it mean that they're likely to get COVID-19? And how severe could their bout of infection possibly be?
Yeah, very good question. What it means is that any individual who is vaccinated with that immunization schedule has an 80% reduction in risk of getting a COVID illness. Whether that's mild or severe, they're all counted in that figure. So some people will get an illness, but what they're very unlikely to get is severe COVID and hospitalization, and certainly massively reduced risk of dying from COVID is what we're seeing in the data on the numbers so far. So I think that can be reassuring. It may well be that people who are vaccinated still get a mild COVID infection, but they're very unlikely indeed, much less than a 20% risk of getting severe COVID or ending up in hospital from that virus.
I spoke to the Director General of the Indian Council for Medical Research. He says that the data before the Indian government is for dose 1 and 2 to be administered at a gap of 28 days, and that's what they will do initially. You're saying that the vaccine is most efficacious at a gap of 3 months, and I'm wondering if you're the ones who created the vaccine and you're telling us that it's best to take it 3 months later. Why are we taking it at a gap of 28 days? What is the data that you have which the Indian government doesn't have at this moment, and would you urge the Indian government then to administer the vaccine in a 3-month period? How do you wrap your head around this?
Yeah, it's not very complicated. Both the UK regulators and now the Indian regulators have said that the vaccine can be given at 4 weeks, 8 weeks, or 12 weeks as the interval between vaccination. So the Indian government has not prescribed exactly that interval. It is, we think, somewhat better with a longer interval. It's still very useful indeed with a short interval of 4 weeks. And indeed, with a single dose, without giving the second dose at all, the efficacy is 73%. So you can see we're discussing small differences, 73% versus 80% here. The most important thing by far is not to get too tied up in what exactly the efficacy is of different vaccines, as they all work very well, and to be able to deploy these rapidly, because that's what we need to do. We need to reduce the transmission of this virus, to prevent illness, and end this pandemic. So the challenge now is deployment of these vaccines.
The gorilla in the cold storage room where the vaccines are stored is the mutant virus. Now these jumps that are happening with new strains, particularly the UK strain of COVID-19, which is causing alarm not just in the United Kingdom but globally. The Indian government's assessment is that they aren't fully certain whether the Oxford University AstraZeneca vaccine provides full immunity against this new strain. As the man who had developed the Oxford University vaccine, how confident are you, Professor Hill, that your vaccine works against the new strain, or is that a grey area that bothers you?
So the first thing to say is that all of the vaccines that we've been talking about use the same part of the coronavirus to immunize against. It's called the spike antigen, and I think all the vaccines that have been advanced to late-stage clinical development or licensed all work against this spike protein of the coronavirus. The important point is that is a very large protein. We count the amino acids in that, and it's of the order of 1,200. What this mutant strain, or variant strain as we might call it, has is a very small number of changes in that very large coronavirus spike antigen of about 1,200 amino acids. Do those very small numbers make a difference? Nearly everybody expects that it will not, because the immunity that we generate with the vaccines spreads right across that spike protein. And if you have a small change here or there, it's likely to make very little difference. The uncertainty you mentioned is that the key experiment to demonstrate that there is no impairment of immunity with the variant is ongoing right now. I guess we may have a result in a week, but that's fairly straightforward to do. It just takes 2 or 3 weeks to get the data. I think most people are agreed it's very unlikely that the variant that is most prevalent in the UK is a problem for vaccination. There's another variant from South Africa that's being looked at as well. So that's why people are saying they're very confident that this should not make a difference, but we haven't got the final data right yet. That will be coming soon.
But is this a potential landmine for the vaccination program? There's now talk of the vaccine jumping from the human species to minks. We saw at mink farms in Denmark and Netherlands, the entire farm was culled, thousands of minks killed because of the fear that if it jumps back to the human body, then that would be a mutation that the vaccine would not be able to deal with. So is this essentially, in layman's speak, a ticking time bomb, that there could be some mutation, some change in the virus which makes the vaccine ineffective? It may not be the UK strain, but it could happen at some point in time.
It could happen at some point in time, but for that to happen, my guess is you would need a very large number of changes in the spike protein. Not 1, not 2, not 3, maybe 20, 30, 40. And yes, that could happen over time, but you know, we've had almost a year of this virus so far, and we have nothing like that number of changes in the spike protein. It's not impossible that it could happen, it's just very unlikely. So I don't think we should be particularly concerned about that now. If it did happen, we can fairly rapidly make a vaccine with the new strain being targeted with a new vaccine. But at the moment, that certainly is not necessary in our view. What we need now is to get this vaccine into people's arms as quickly and efficiently and in very large numbers as we possibly can.
Typically, it takes 14 to 15 years for a vaccine to get approval. This vaccination process and the whole process of regulatory approvals is being pushed through in less than a year. And there are many who will be watching at this time who are wondering whether they should be the first ones queuing up to get the vaccine. Should they wait for a while, see what happens to the others, what kind of effects they have, and importantly, about long-term side effects. How much do we know? Because there hasn't been a study over a long term. There's been studies only over a few weeks and months. So what do you know about the potential long-term side effects of these vaccines?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the answer is different for different vaccine types. Some vaccines, like the RNA ones, are very new, and they have not been followed for, say, a year in tens of thousands of people, which is what you'd like to see. For the Oxford AstraZeneca Serum Institute vaccine, we know that this type of vaccine, which has been around since the 1990s, a common cold virus vector vaccine, has been given to very large numbers of people now, either for other indications like an Ebola vaccine. We use the same vaccine type there in large numbers of individuals, or now for COVID. So just to give you a scale on this, the number of people who've been in clinical trials of this vaccine is around about 60,000. And most of those have had the coronavirus vaccine. Some have had a control vaccine or a different vaccine for comparison. But you can see immediately that there are tens of thousands of people who have been safely vaccinated, who have been followed. There have been no significant concerns on safety in any of the trials, whether they're in India or in the UK or in Brazil or in the United States or in South Africa or other countries. So I think people can be reassured by that. But, you know, the only way to absolutely demonstrate long-term safety is to wait. But again, remember that most vaccines that give side effects in the few weeks after vaccination. It's extremely rare to see very late side effects turning up 2 years, for example, after vaccination. Not impossible, but very unlikely indeed.
And typically, what are the kind of side effects that have been reported in the trials that you've conducted? In all the cases where your vaccine's been administered, what are the kind of typical side effects that are being reported, and how frequently is that happening?
Yes, we know the answer to that very clearly. People can get sore arms. They can get a little bit of swelling where the needle is injected into their arm. Sometimes a slight discoloration, but typically that lasts 1 or 2 days and is then gone. And in addition, you may get a fever, or at least feel feverish in the day or two after vaccination. That's generally mild. It's treatable by paracetamol or other drugs. And again, it's short-lived. It's 1 or 2 days. So those minor side effects or minor to moderate side effects occur in a proportion of people, but they are gone fairly quickly. So again, regulators are very familiar with that side effect profile. It's seen for many other vaccines, and we see it again with this COVID vaccine.
There are some Muslim clerics in India who have raised alarm about the use of pork gelatin in the production of these vaccines. They're calling for their followers to boycott the vaccine because it's not safe as per their belief. Is that true? What do you want to tell religious leaders who are raising these issues about the manner in which these vaccines have been produced, sir?
Yes, we've had input from various religions, not just Muslims, commenting that vaccines must have certain properties. And that's right. What I would recommend is to look very carefully at what is actually in the vaccine to make sure that what they're concerned about is there, because these are very purified vaccines manufactured to extremely high quality with a great deal of detail on the composition of the vaccine. And there certainly should be a vaccine that for COVID that all religions are happy with.
Have you got the shot yourself? What kind of side effects did you have? What can you share about your personal experience, Professor?
No, I can't, because I haven't had the AstraZeneca vaccine myself, but I have seen very large numbers of people who have, and as I described a moment ago, those side effects are pretty well tolerated.
Okay, I am hugely curious to know why the man who's helping develop this vaccine and wanting the world to take it hasn't taken the vaccine himself, Professor Hill.
Well, we have a policy on this, as you probably know. You can have the vaccine if you volunteer for a clinical trial. And indeed, many people at the University of Oxford have. and they have been vaccinated with the relevant vaccine or with a control, and they have contributed to that large number of tens of thousands of people who have tested the vaccine. It's not generally regarded as good practice for people who are in a senior role in managing the trial to volunteer and participate themselves. So I would discourage that for people who are in a position of responsibility about a trial, actually volunteering to be in that trial. And as you know, the vaccine is now licensed in the UK in the last week. It is becoming available and it is being administered first to high-risk groups. So that generally is people over the age of 80 or over the age of 90. I don't qualify for that group, and for healthcare workers. So as a healthcare worker, I will be vaccinated fairly soon, but it just hasn't happened yet.
And one line, last question, I would wonder if you have a comment to offer on the Indian government's decision to give approval to a second vaccine candidate from Bharat Biotech. Their phase 3 trial results aren't public, they haven't been peer reviewed, but emergency approvals have been granted in clinical trial mode, which is something that some healthcare experts like Dr. Kang have questioned. Is that something that you have concerns about?
I'm afraid I don't know the details of the Bharat vaccine, but I can say generally that, look, we are delighted. The more vaccines that are approved for dealing with COVID as soon as possible, the better for India, the better for the world. And of course, regulators have this very much in mind when they're looking at the safety and efficacy data of new vaccines. So we are in a position where no vaccine can solve this problem on its own. We need multiple vaccines. We need billions of doses. If you can make 1 billion doses of one vaccine in a year, as a manufacturer, you've done amazingly well. But more than 1 billion doses are needed. So let's be clear, any vaccine that works pretty well is contributing to the solution to this terrible pandemic problem.
I'm going to leave it over there. Professor Adrian Hill, it has been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. We are delighted with the work that your scientists and you have done to produce this vaccine in such quick time. It has been a huge personal and professional achievement as well. Fingers crossed. Hope the rollout happens in a manner that doesn't produce any side effects and that humanity can bounce back from this terrible pandemic. I wish you all the best and thank you deeply for having taken out time to join us on the Newstrack. That is one of the key scientists involved in the production, the manufacturing, the science and the research behind the Oxford University vaccine that's finally got government's approval. I'm slipping into a break. When we come back, two key scientific advisors in the government, the man who heads up the government's COVID-19 task force, Dr. V.K. Paul from the NITI Aayog. To Dr. V.K. Paul, chairperson of the government's COVID-19 task force. He's one of the key pillars of the government's planning of its COVID-19 response. Dr. Paul, welcome. And you've given to Indian citizens the best possible news, the fact that government has approved the rollout of these 2 Desi manufactured vaccines, and that's a good news, that's a good note for everyone to start the new year with. So welcome, Dr. Paul. It's great to have you with us on India Today.
Well, welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much. It is indeed a very important day and it makes us proud as Indians.
Dr. Paul, in that press conference done by the Director General of, in the manner in which the approvals were announced, what's not certain from the drug controller are a few questions which I hope to put to you over the next several minutes. Question number 1, when does the actual vaccine rollout start? Do you have a firm date in your mind at this moment? When will the first vaccine to the first citizen of India be administered after these emergency approvals?
Well, Rahul, the most important rate limiting step or the rate limiting milestone has been achieved today because vaccines can only be rolled out once there is a licensure. So today we have the licensure, but as you are aware, in parallel, a massive preparation has been going on. And yesterday we had a nationwide dry run, so to speak, the mock run or a rehearsal on a national scale. So the preparations have been have been moving pretty well. And today, the licensure has been granted to the vaccines. And now it is only a matter of days, or I would say very few days, when a launch can take place. Please remember, only after the licensure does the supply, picks up. The supply of vaccines has to move to the major hubs, storage hubs that we have in the country. These are about 30 plus storage hubs, and from there, then the state level supply chain happen through the cold chain all through. This will start very, very soon. At the same time, last minute preparations in terms of micro planning will also begin at the points where the launch would start and the rollout will happen. So I would say it's a matter of a very few days. We are on track, and you will hear about a date very soon.
Okay, let's take the two vaccine candidates separately. I'll start with Bharat Biotech first because lesser is known about them in the public domain. Question number one, what are the results of the efficacy clinical trials and the phase 3 trials of the Bharat Biotech vaccine? So far, those details aren't out yet, and people have questions about how efficacious and effective that vaccine really is.
Well, these details will be put out very soon as per the practice of the DCGI system, and you will see them as they appear. But in principle, broadly, this is where we are. They have given vaccine in phase 3 to more than 22,000 individuals. Second dosing has been done to a fewer number of people, and these individuals in phase 3 trial, both in the placebo and the vaccine arms, are on follow-up. From phase 3 data, as yet, efficacy data is not available. This efficacy data would appear in time as the follow-up of the people who have been dosed is available in time to come. But remember, the reason why an emergency use licensure has been given based on the available proceedings of the subject expert committee are in a different light. Firstly, there is safety data which is now available on such a large number of Indians, including the phase 3 subjects, in such a large number. Safety issue is settled, more or less. It is only having minimal side effects, if at all, and very, very acceptable level. In any case, we did not expect many side effects because it's a killed virus vaccine. Number two, immunogenicity, the second criteria, has been eminently proven already. It was proven in multiple animal models which were given a challenge of the virus. They were actually exposed to live virus in a very controlled environment in our national NIV, National Institute of Virology. That proof exists, and subsequently, of course, in phase 1 and phase 2 and part phase 3, strong immunogenicity data is available. These two criteria are met. Efficacy data will come as the clinical trial, which is ongoing, reaches its endpoints in terms of events of COVID-19 infection. But remember, the reason why I believe the scientific expert group, which comprises clinicians and basic scientists and others, very eminent people, have taken this decision is in the light of one or two things. And that, I think, is a moot point that should be known to people. Firstly, a killed virus vaccine, as it exists today, this vaccine is producing immune response to multiple proteins or antigens on the surface of the virus. Let me explain what it means. Most other vaccines are targeting the S protein or parts of the S protein, the spike protein, whether it is Moderna vaccine or Pfizer, or for that matter, Covishield, or even the Sputnik vaccine. So in case there is a perturbation around that protein, as we had feared in relation to the UK variant, then these vaccines could potentially be losing efficacy. Potentially. We hope they won't. And they have not. We can authentically say, till today, there is no question about any mutant disturbing the efficacy of all the other vaccines that we are hearing about. That's a given fact. However, in the case of this vaccine, since it is picking up the immunogenicity against multiple proteins on the surface of the virus, it is unlikely, for all practical purposes, perhaps never, would actually be disturbed by mutations unless they happen in so many different ways. So it is a vaccine which, in the face
can
of
I ask one question, sir? You've just
would still continue to work. This has been an important consideration.
Sir, sure, and I appreciate that, but here's the brass tacks. The phase 3 clinical trials is still going on. The efficiency data is not available, not just to us, but also to government. And you've gone ahead and given emergency use licensure. Now the question is, while of course everyone is desperately waiting for a vaccine and they want it to be rolled out as soon as possible so that people can get the injection, get on with their lives, but are we rushing the process through? What is it that you wish to say to those who are skeptics, who are not convinced with the fact that efficiency data is not available, yet clearances have been given? You're hoping, and you've given an elaborate reason for why you believe that it shouldn't have an effect, but isn't equal to 100%. So basically, we're giving clearance without being 100%. Is that correct?
Well, Rahul, that is why it is emergency use authorization. Remember, an emergency use authorization, even in the case of any other vaccine, is in the face of a relatively less complete data and information. That's why it's an emergency authorization. And remember the other condition, which covers the point that you're making. It is said in the recommendation, and I support that when you use this vaccine, unlike the Covishield vaccine, you will use it in the clinical trial mode. This is a very critical conditionality attached to the use of ICMR Bharat Biotech vaccine. That means those who will receive this vaccine will be followed up and will be treated as if they are part of a clinical trial. They will be consenting to be a part of receiving the vaccine. In any case, all vaccines are voluntary to be taken, and they'll be followed up as if they are in a clinical trial, and they'll be watched, they'll be observed in a very keen manner. And thirdly, remember, the clinical trial goes on, and as it unfolds, as the efficacy data becomes available, further decisions by the DCGI would be taken. So it is, you see, why we have gone for this, I believe, is because there is an emergency situation. It is our guarantee against particularly potential mutations that may vitiate the utility of other vaccines. And God forbid, if we have a massive outbreak of such variants of the virus, we would be in a fix. And this vaccine is therefore a special guarantee for us. At the same time, it is to be operated within the system which is scientifically valid and appropriate under the oversight of the clinical trial regime.
Dr. V.K. Paul, how many of these is the government purchasing from the companies in phase 1? How many are you purchasing from Bharat Biotech? How many are you purchasing from Serum Institute? And what will be the scale of the rollout, say in the first 1 month? In the first 1 month, how many vaccines do you hope to administer to citizens of this country?
Well, the specific number is yet to be decided. As you know, the first wave is to cover 30 crore individuals. 26 crore of them are people above the age of 50, and that's a real focus of the first wave. But to begin the first wave would be the vaccination of healthcare workers and frontline workers. And then as it picks up, the other waves will start, and at a given time, then they'll be all operating simultaneously in very near future. We still have to work out exact how many the doses have to be ordered, let's say this month, and how many to come next month. I think it's a matter of time now that we know that we have these two options. So this will unfold. But remember, we would like to complete vaccination of the people overall in the quickest time possible based on the availability of the total repertoire of vaccines that we have. Tomorrow, we may have a third vaccine. Sputnik vaccine may be available, Cadila vaccine may be available. So the stockpile will be building up steadily, and the speed of vaccination would also increase in keeping with the available stockpile, available supplies as they build up. And therefore, it is our hope that these 300 million people, the entire first wave, could be covered in a matter of a few months. And from our point of view, soonest possible, because to administer vaccine on ground, we have time-tested programs such as the UIP and our election experience. So that can happen pretty rapidly, but it has to be matched with the available supply.
Okay.
And the supply chain.
I also want to welcome on this broadcast now Professor Vijay Raghavan, Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India. As I say, a thank you to Dr. V.K. Paul, who's the chairperson of the government's COVID-19 task force. Thank you, Dr. Paul, and welcome, Professor Vijay Raghavan. And this is indeed a big day, the first Indian vaccines getting approval. But I have a few questions I want to build on. Between the time that the vaccine leaves, the manufacturing facility reaches the logistics hubs, goes to the end point where the vaccine will be administered, how are you hoping to ensure that there is no contamination? Because these vaccines require cold storage. We know that electricity is patchy in certain parts of our country, especially in rural India. We also know that cold storage in a clinical trial in comparison with the real world is very different. So how do you ensure? It's happened in the US. I mean, there the refrigeration norms are also slightly different, but it's happened in the US where some vaccines couldn't be administered in time, they went waste. So how foolproof do you think this process will be from the manufacturing facilities to the end point? Professor Vijay Raghavan.
Thank you very much. The cold chain process rigor is something which has been put in place very well for some time now in our maternal and childhood immunization programs. This program, of course, now is a much larger scale, but that too has been put in place with multiple dry runs. These dry runs involve tests of cold chain reliability, which is automated and then verified by digital mechanisms. So if a vaccine carton or a container or the bulk has altered its temperature for any period of time which is deleterious, we would know immediately.
What happens to those who are outside the plus 50 comorbid category and are hoping to get a vaccine? Is there any thought in government yet about when these vaccines could be sold to those who can afford them and want to purchase them from a chemist in the open market?
We have been extraordinarily patient over the year, and indeed, if you look back, a year is a very short period for vaccine development. A few more months, we would have bulk availability of these vaccines, other vaccines, in a manner where these questions would be moot. So I would counsel a little patience. Those who are comorbid outside this category and who need vaccines, of course, they also will fall into the priority groups and they will get that. But as bulk availability becomes more and more ready, you're going to see more and more ease of these kinds of questions being answered.
Last week I was at the manufacturing facilities of the Serum Institute in Pune, and there I learned that the government has so far ordered 2 crore vaccine doses in the first phase. They are sitting on a manufacturing storage of 5 crore, 50 million doses. And what happens to the remaining? Does the government have the capacity to be able to purchase all that Bharat Biotech, Serum, other companies in India can produce, or will the government be constrained in terms of what it can possibly consume and distribute?
You know, there have been multiple meetings over the past few months in which finance ministry officials were also present. And they have set aside very significant resources to be able to purchase outright. In addition, later on going ahead, there will be multiple instruments available to ensure vaccine supplies to all those who need it are not wanting. So I would not worry about that. Vaccines.
No, but can you give us a specific amount that you think the government has set aside for the vaccine project? There was some talk of how maybe the ask was 80,000 crore rupees for this vaccine rollout. What is the quantum of resources the government has set aside? Is there clarity on that?
Yeah. What happens is, in terms of pricing of vaccines, that is a matter which is negotiated with multiple groups and agencies. India is very fortunate that because of the manufacturing in India, the costs are much lower than what they are in the West. For example, in the West, typically costs would range from the tens of dollars, and here they would range in a few dollars per vial. And therefore, those costs are much more reasonable than what is there internationally. So I can't tell you the exact figure, but it'll be something which India can afford, and certainly the government will set aside.
We have 1.3 billion plus people in this country. Dr. Vijay Raghavan, how many do you think will need to be vaccinated? Are you looking to vaccinate the entire population in the first phase? You're looking at 30 crore people being vaccinated. What is the end point of this project? How many people in India will need to be vaccinated?
I'm glad you asked this question because this is a very important scientific question. There are multiple parameters involved. First, properties of the vaccine. How effective is the vaccine in the field? So that's a certain number which should be judged as vaccines are rolled out. But that also relates to how infective the disease is. That's an intrinsic property of the virus. And there could be strains which are more transmissible or less transmissible. Thirdly, the transmissibility is also a property of how we behave, how close to each other we are, what distance we keep, whether we wear masks or not, how distributed our population is, our demography is. So all these parameters add up to a input into equation from which one can calculate what level of vaccination is needed to acquire vaccine-derived immunity. Given the situation with the virus and how worrying changes are already taking place in some parts of the world and reaching everywhere else, I would say it's very important as vaccination progresses. It's just started, it's not yet actually started. We must put in place all the other measures to increase distancing effectively by wearing masks and other non-pharmaceutical interventions so that vaccines are very effective even as viral strains might become more transmissible.
People who are watching will wonder, should I get the Bharat Biotech vaccine? Should I get the serum vaccine? Should I wait for Sputnik 5? Should I wait for Pfizer or Moderna? Especially Pfizer is the best known of these pharma companies. How do you look at this question about choice? What's the difference according to you between the Bharat Biotech vaccine and the Serum Institute vaccine? And would you, for example, rather wait for Pfizer to come to India and then try and get hold of a Pfizer vaccine?
We must understand what the authorizations are. The current authorization for serum is for emergency use in specific kinds of contexts. The authorization for Bharat is slightly different. It requires a calibration of the context a little more carefully where there are potential dangers of other vaccines or new strains being troublesome. And then the third set of vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna are not yet in India. I would say in summary that if a vaccine is made available to you in a public immunization program, you can be assured that it's gone through steps which are safe, there is immunogenicity, and there's efficacy. And we should have no hesitation in taking that.
No, sure, I hear what you're saying, but even you don't know at this time what is the efficacy of the phase 3 of the Bharat Biotech vaccine. The trial is on, the efficacy data hasn't been made public, and since the trial is on, the efficacy data isn't final. So yes, you're saying Ram Bharose, Bhagwan ka naam leke, have faith in us and take the vaccine, But like I know, for example, that in Moderna and Pfizer's case it's 94.5, 94. In one case it's 90 plus. In the case of Serum it's 70 plus. In the case of Bharat Biotech, I don't know. So yes, I do, and I'm sure many people will relate to this. We do believe in the idea that you have to get a vaccine, but are we rushing the process too much?
Well, you must again read carefully what the drug controller and the health ministry's statements are. They basically say that the Bharat Biotech vaccine will be given in situations which are carefully monitored in a sort of clinical trial equivalent context, while the third phase clinical trial is independently going on. So those efficacy results will come, they will be evaluated, and an authorization, should everything go okay, will be given. This current situation is for a state where the decisions are being taken in case there is a serious situation which warrants their administration. So you're not going to see, unlike the Serum situation, it rolled out in that level to frontline workers and healthcare workers. And by the time that phase is complete, we're going to see results from the Bharat Biotech third phase trials, and we will know where we stand. And all indications are that one can have an expectation of success there, but until that is over, it's not over.
Is there a particular date in mind? There's some talk about Makar Sankranti, there's some talk about Republic Day. Which is the day that the first Indian dose will be administered on an Indian citizen, sir?
Well, you heard Dr. Paul and earlier Dr. Guleria on various channels. The expectation is that all the steps will be done in a few days' time, which is about a week or 12 days or 15 days, and we're likely to see vaccination rolling out in that period.
What do you think about the politics that's broken out? We saw Akhilesh Yadav say ये BJP की vaccine है, ये मैं नहीं लगाऊंगा. This is a problem globally. We saw it with Donald Trump in the United States. Very strong anti-vaccine sense coming out among some Trump supporters. And now in India as well, you've got politics raging. Some members of the Congress have spoken out. Akhilesh Yadav, the most notable leader of the Samajwadi Party, speaking out against the vaccines. How badly could political comments like these jeopardize the vaccine rollout and people's faith in what they're being administered?
That is not an area of my expertise, and so I can't get into that. But let me say, importantly, that there will be a variety of different kinds of questions on vaccines. It's important that public leaders speak with care and caution about their views, because their views have an extraordinary impact. It is perfectly legitimate, however, to raise important questions, and it's important that scientists answer these questions. So the framing of the questions and the concerns needs to be done fully, and all of us in science will be very happy to answer them fully.
And finally, what about those who say, हमें टीका नहीं लगाना? There's all kinds of controversies about whether there's some pork product, whether there's some beef product in the vaccine. There are all kinds of religious leaders, apart from the politicians, who've been speaking out. Is there a plan that the scientists community has to try and assuage concerns of those who are being swayed by these vaccine naysayers or skeptics?
We have gone through an incredible year where there's been phenomenal suffering and mortality all over the world. Vaccines, all said and done, provide the safe way out. And vaccines are given to healthy people and therefore must go through rigorous trials and then be introduced. It's very important to keep in mind, therefore, that when people raise these concerns, better communication is absolutely important, because unless most people take vaccines and unless they take them willingly, we will not be protected against this disease. So it's important that a good communication program which persuades people that this is the right thing to do is conducted, and that's very important.
I'll leave it over there. Professor Vijay Raghavan, thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you all the best with what is arguably mankind's biggest ever vaccine rollout. You know, there have been multiple vaccines over the decades that have been rolled out, but never at such speed, at some scale, with concerns about safety and efficacy. We'll track how this goes, but a big decisions taken today, formalized and made public. We wish you all the best for the next steps. Thank you very much, Professor Raghavan, for joining us.
Thank you.